Hello, this is Real World Audio, and I'm going to talk about octaves and the frequency spectrum. So basically breaking down the frequency range, how people call them, and I'm not really focusing on what are the official ranges for deep bass, mid bass, upper bass, and so on. But here I'm trying to provide a means of how it is perhaps more useful to think about the different frequency spectrums that cover the entire range. And why I'm doing this? Basically, I'm doing this because when you hear about mid bass and upper bass, mid range, if you go into it, every definition you read will give you different frequency range for the same thing. So for example, some people define mid bass as 60 hertz through 250 hertz. Others will be like 50 hertz to 125 hertz, and there's just generally confusion about it. And why is that happening? Partially that's because, like, for a bass player, the frequency spectrum has a little bit different connotation, little bit different meaning than for a piccolo player. So here, with this video, I would like to present a different view that is not focusing on even numbers, that is not focusing on how audio engineers think to break down the sound, but this I'm going to show you a view that is focused on music itself, on the actual octaves, the actual notes that are part of the music, and I'm going to present the frequency spectrum in relationship to those music notes that we actually hear from actual music. And to ground this, I'm going to go to Glow in the Dark Audio's website, and he has made a really nice composition here, going from like below to 50 hertz through 16 kilohertz, and he is covering the range of approximate fundamental range of instruments and voices. What does that mean? So fundamental is the bass frequency. So when you hear a note that we call, like, let's say like on the cello, let's say there's an 80 hertz note, it doesn't mean that all you hear is 80 hertz, but it means that the fundamental, the strongest frequency you hear is 80 hertz, but there's going to be upper harmonic resonances added to it that go higher than the fundamental range of the instrument and can reach up to the kilohertz region as well. And that 80 hertz fundamental frequency will also have 40 hertz lower frequency subharmonic, and also possibly 20 hertz subharmonics as well. So that's why these ranges, what he's showing here for piano, cello, violin, trumpet, male vocal and female vocal, that these are the fundamental frequencies. So basically the upper harmonics add to this region and lower harmonics add as well. And here this gray, that's the mid-range. And he says generally agreed to be mid-range frequencies. And I agree with him wholeheartedly, because mid-range is defined differently. For you look it up in 5 places, all 5 will give you an exact range which is different, but generally 500 hertz to 2 kilohertz is generally agreed to be the meat of the mid-range. And as you see, over 8 kilohertz, it's considered the brilliance region, and that's mostly harmonic content. So there are no music notes for basically for any instrument. Maybe for like the highest organ pipes have some notes in this region. Piccolo and instruments like that have a couple notes in this region, but mostly this is just the upper harmonic of these instruments who have fundamentals in that range. So let's go back to our video, and all the music notes that we hear that are in the scores are organized into octaves. And what on earth is an octave? An octave literally means 8 sounds, 8 notes. And it covers a frequency range that goes from a certain frequency to double the frequency. And in between those two extremes, let's say, in our case, a C4 note at 256 hertz, let me call it 256 hertz for simplicity. And if you go a 1 octave higher note, that's called C5, and that will be double the frequency, that will be 512 hertz. A C6 would be double that, so it would be 1024 hertz, and so on. So when you go 1 octave higher, it means all the notes within the octave will be exactly twice the frequency compared to the lower octave. And now why I chose to begin with the C4 octave, because that's the middle octave on the keyboard of the piano. So this octave, the 4th octave, includes the A4 note. And that's also called as the A440 hertz note, right? And that's the middle key on the piano. So that's the middle keyboard. Middle key on the keyboard. And why is that such a special note? Because when there's a concert, then the musicians tune their instruments to the A4 note. So they make sure that the A4 is exactly at the same frequency for all of the instruments. And today, and also throughout the 20th century, all musicians have agreed to tune the A4 to 440 hertz. But they can tune it higher and lower than that. So for example, they can tune it to 420 hertz or 432 hertz, 406 hertz, whatever they might want to pick. And as long as everyone is tuned to the exact same frequency, it will be a beautiful performance. But let's say half of the instruments are tuned to A440, and there's 2 instruments to A420, and there's one tuned to A406. That will be horrible. That will be, everyone will notice, even those who don't have any musical training, that those instruments are really, really off tune, really off key. And that's why, because they are tuned to a different frequency. And just a little information on that. This is the current frequency for 440 hertz, but in going back in time, the frequency was lower and lower. So in the Baroque era, the A4 was anywhere between 406 to 425. And basically every orchestra had their own tuning, and that created a little bit of confusion if you wanted to move from, let's say, from Vienna to London and play there. And it was a little bit confusing that they just used differently tuned instruments. And to make it easier, to make a worldwide performances more feasible, that's why the A440 was recently introduced. Now, if we go for the A440, then the C4 is actually 261.5 hertz. I'm using the 256 hertz because it's an easier to work with number for these calculations, and we don't need to go to fractions for numbers. And actually, I'm pretty sure that you have already heard a couple of performances where C4 was tuned to 256, and it does happen with Baroque pieces even today. If a Baroque piece is performed the way it's written and the way it was intended, then they will not tune the instruments to A440. That's not authentic. Now, the first thing is when we look at the octaves are the mid-range octaves. So roughly 50% of the sound that we perceive, that our brains process, is the mid-range. I would say even more than 50%. And the vast majority of that 50%, 33% of all the information that our brain processes is this octave. C7 octave, 2 to 4 kilohertz. This is this region where our hearing is the most accurate. You see that dip, the dippy dip there. This is, that dip is covering the C7 octave between 2 and 7 kilohertz. And that's where babies cry. And that's why your hearing is most acute in that range, because if we were ignorant to the baby's cry, then we wouldn't have made it as a Homo sapiens species, you know. That's our top priority, to take care of those little offsprings who are yet unable to take care of themselves. And as they grow up, the fundamental of their crying and speaking gets lower and lower in frequency. So like growing children, they have the C6 octave mid-range, which is between 1 and 2 kilohertz fundamentals. Like bigger kids, already C5 octave, and the C4 octave is the lower mid-range. So adults use that range predominantly, especially women. This is, and for men, they can come up to the C4 octave or go down to the C3. So if a man's voice is predominantly towards the lowest half of C3 octave, then he's considered to have a really deep voice. And if he is like in the C4 range already, then he has a higher voice. And but out of the mid-range, these two octaves, the C5 and the C6, are the meat of the mid-range. The C7 octave is the upper mid-range, and C4 is the lower mid-range. Now, the high octaves. These are about 40% of our sound perception, so like the second biggest chunk that our brain is processing, where we get a big part of the information of the world around us. And these two octaves are responsible for the formation of a precise 3D image of the universe around us. Because the sounds we hear, we do not hear in 3D. We just hear a left channel and a right channel, and both of them are flat and give us zero cues of the direction the sound was coming from. Those cues which tell our brains whether the sound came from close to you or far away, came from the floor, came from around the ceiling, from the left, from the right, and all of this, what was the angle, etc., everything is calculated by your brain from the frequency content of the sound, and from the difference between left and right channel, and the phase changes between the two channel, phase changes between the octaves, between different sounds, between upper harmonics, intermodulation, distortion. So all of these things, the brain makes literally billions of calculations per second to calculate a precise 3D image. And actually, it's also using the mid-range down to 500 hertz, these three octaves, 500 through 4 kilohertz for the raw 3D location, and uses the high frequency 2 octaves for the precise, the accurate pinpoint precise fine tuning of the 3D information. And the C8 octave is the lower highs, which is generally called as the presence, that gives the presence of sound, and the C9 octave is the brilliance, called as brilliance, so 8 kilohertz to 16 and 4 to 8 kilohertz. And now this will be the next one. We are going to talk about ultrasound, and we are also going into how the bass is, but that will be part of our next video. So let's see how that works out, and we'll see that video is going to come out tomorrow. Bye bye.